Now, it's not every day that a space company exposes another space company's lies. But today, we're going to be looking at how the SpaceX satellite train completely debunks the notion of an ISS that is orbiting a ridiculous 17,500 miles around a spinning ball Earth. Now, this ISS is reportedly slightly larger than a football field. Have you ever seen the ISS physically being built? I haven't. So how do we know it even exists? Well, it doesn't, and today we're going to be looking at that. Now, I find it interesting when you compare two objects in the sky that are basically two different altitudes and significantly different in sizes, that we should be able to then observe that in our skies. The satellites are the first of a planned 12,000 satellite mega constellation. Now, I'm not sure if that's a sly way of them wanting to make artificial constellations that we see in the sky, but they've already received a number of complaints from astronomers and people alike. Now they want this 12,000 satellites to provide internet access to the people on Earth, which is probably the most stupidest idea anyway. I mean, I don't understand how anyone would want to spend that sort of money putting these satellites into the sky when 5G is literally killing the market. Pun intended. Now, they supposedly launched 60 Starlink satellites into the atmosphere at a ridiculous altitude of 440 kilometers. Now, this footage was taken in the Netherlands of the satellite train. So pay attention to the size of the light that you see on each satellite. And keep in mind that the size of these satellites are reported to be the size of an office desk. Now, these satellites also appear to have, well, they say that they've got a solar wing, which is being depicted here by CGI. Now, we know how space companies are quite renowned for their CGI images. They love painting that little pretty picture of what space would be like, so you're going to have to use your imagination for the rest. Now, let's see what SpaceX CEO has to say about the solar arrays during the initial orbit. Following the chorus of concerns, SpaceX founder and CEO Elon Musk responded the satellite solar arrays had not yet been pointed at the sun. The solar arrays were not yet pointed at the sun when this footage was being captured. These office-sized desk satellites were apparently initially orbiting at 440 kilometers altitude. Okay, so here is some footage that people have captured of the satellites. Now, the first thing that you'll notice is that they just happen to look as bright as the ISS. The next thing that you'll notice is that they just so happen to be going this same apparent speed as the ISS. And it just so happens to look similar in size as the ISS. It's easy to see what's going on here, guys. Yet, since I think critically about what I'm seeing, I get called the crazy conspiracy theorist. By far, the most reflective element of a satellite are its solar arrays. Once operational, the Starlink satellite solar arrays will be pointed away from the Earth to soak up the solar arrays, or the solar rays. In this position, the amount of reflection emanating from the arrays and the satellites as a whole should be reduced significantly. Now listen to what he just said. Once they raise the solar arrays, the satellites as a whole should be reduced significantly. Keep this in mind. So then what is causing the underside of these office-sized satellites to light up as bright as the ISS? I mean, it can't be Earthshine because most of this footage was captured in the middle of the night, and it can't be the sun because, again, it's the middle of the night. Now, if you want to believe that these are being illuminated by the sun, then again, I'll just refer you to what Mr. Musk said in the article. The amount of reflection emanating from the arrays and the satellites as a whole should be reduced significantly. And this is all happening when these things get to 550 kilometers altitude, because again, this footage was only captured at 440 kilometers with their quote-unquote initial orbit. Now, since the satellite solar arrays had not yet been pointed at the sun, as Elon said, it's safe to assume the bottom of the quote-unquote satellites are facing the Earth. Now, I highly doubt that each satellite was equipped with enough LEDs attached to the bottom of them to make them illuminate brighter than the ISS. My thought is that these are just there to be a spectacle for everyone to see on the initial orbit, and for people to take photos and videos, to prove that there actually are satellites orbiting a spinning ball Earth, again, which is completely nonsensical. Now, remember guys, according to Elon, by far the most reflective element of a satellite are its solar arrays. Now let's move on. Let's see how the SpaceX satellites debunk the ISS. Let's have a look at the angular size comparison of the ISS and the size of one of these satellites. This is where it becomes very apparent, as there is not much difference at all, and this is the problem. Here is a size comparison of the ISS and a standard size office desk. Now, where the problem lies, as I mentioned, is the apparent size of the ISS. The ISS is supposedly at an altitude of only 408 kilometers, and we see the same apparent size of a SpaceX satellite at an altitude of 440 kilometers altitude. Are you beginning to see the problem here? How is it logically possible that the ISS and a SpaceX satellite appear to be the same angular size in the sky when a satellite the size of an office desk is at an altitude of 440 kilometers and the ISS is the size of a football field at an altitude of only 408 kilometers? This is an entire 32 kilometers lower than the ISS. But the comparison of both objects when you look at the footage appear to be almost exactly the same size. Until now, we haven't actually been able to compare the apparent size of the ISS at its altitude with something else that is higher in altitude than the ISS, and of course, still visible to us. But now we have another object higher than the apparent ISS, we do have something to compare it to. This is now very apparent that the office desk satellites completely debunk the notion of an ISS flying over our heads that are supposedly larger than a football field. Now, after seeing this video, you still believe that an object larger than a football field should have the same apparent size of an office desk that is 32 kilometers higher in altitude, then you need to get your eyes checked and you need to start thinking for yourself. To make a simple analogy, you cannot have a semi-truck and a remote control car appear to be the same size from your vantage point when that truck is 32 kilometers closer to you than the remote control car. So, the question remains, How are these quote-unquote satellites being lit up so bright? Well, at the very least, as I mentioned earlier, SpaceX are doing exactly that. They're making you believe they have a train of 60 satellites orbiting a spinning ball Earth. The train of satellites is most likely a series of connecting high-altitude balloons, and with very bright lights on the bottom of them to give you the appearance that there are orbiting satellites in space. Now, as we know, NASA and other companies, just like Google, launch hundreds of high-altitude balloon satellites into the atmosphere every day. So it's really not so hard to comprehend the fact that SpaceX could launch their own series of high-altitude weather balloons into the atmosphere. Now, as for the ISS, what could it be? Well, we know for a fact that the actual ISS is underwater in NASA's Neutral Buoyancy Lab, and that there's a time schedule that you can look up to see the supposed passes of the ISS. Now, given the speed and the apparent size, it could very well be just a fast high-altitude plane with some sort of reflective or holographic projection projecting the solar panels of the ISS. Again, we know that there exists holographic technologies to this scale, so it's not so far-fetched to think that NASA would be using this technology on a plane. Now, this is the footage I took of the ISS with my P900, and I managed to grab a screenshot and put it through a photo editing app. I basically just adjusted the levels and the so-called solar panels started disappearing, and basically left a silhouette of a plane with wings. So there you have it, folks. SpaceX Starlink satellites debunk NASA's ISS hoax. Now, for the doubters, I want you to really think about what you've just seen. Look again at the apparent sizes of both the ISS and the SpaceX satellite office desks, and the fact we see both objects in the sky almost exactly the same size. This proves undoubtedly that the ISS is a hoax,